Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I discuss the value of a good failure. We talk about the difference between growth and fixed mindsets, how attribution styles affect resiliency. We'll go through some tips on how to reduce your fear of failure and much, much more. If any of you are interested in offering psychedelic-assisted therapy to clients, Numinous offers unique training opportunities for mental health practitioners to develop this expertise. These courses are carefully crafted by Numinous professionals and offer a variety of high-quality learning experiences. If you'd like to learn more about these training opportunities, you can find the link in our show notes below, or you can visit numinous.com/training. That's numinous.com/training. If you'd like to support our show, you can do that by leaving us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also subscribe to the show on your podcast player. That communicates to the algorithm that we're worthy of your listenership, and hopefully they'll put it in front of people who might find our content useful or interesting. Thank you to those of you who've already done that. Preemptive thank you to those of you who will do that. Please enjoy today's episode. Reid, I am an unapologetic comic book fan. And growing up, my brother and I used to talk about how cool it would be if we got really, really good movies based on some of our favorite comic books. And so I'm a huge fan of the Christopher Nolan Batman films.
Mm-hmm.
I love that interpretation of Batman. And in there, there's great lessons about perseverance and, how to handle failure, resilience, And one of my favorite lines in the movie, after Bruce Wayne suffers some kind of profound defeat or setback, Alfred, his butler, says, "Why do we fall, Bruce? So we can learn to pick ourselves back up." And he was quoting a line from Bruce's father, Thomas Wayne. It was supposed to be this inspirational yet complicated figure. But when I was younger and watched that movie, I was like, oh yeah, that's a great quote about resilience and about failure. Why do we fall? So we can learn to pick ourselves back up.
I like that. We sometimes fall into this trap of thinking like success is a goal, like an end goal or the outcome. But I love this quote I heard once upon a time that success is the progressive realization of a worthy ideal. Like it's the journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that too. Progressive realization of a worthy ideal.
Yeah, there's makes me think of, I haven't done much archery, but when I have dabbled in the past, it's interesting that there's this archer's paradox that one, you have to aim just a bit off to the target to hit it, and then this mastery. So sometimes people think success is like getting a bullseye once, but that could just be a fluke. I mean, the mastery they go for is knowing you could do it again. It's like commitment not to the goal, but to a constant pursuit of improvement. And there's value in every miss. Like there's value in the near wins or the close calls big time, because you're progressively realizing that we're the ideal of being able to replicate your successes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so in case it's not obvious to the listeners yet, we're talking about failure and resiliency and grit, persistence, perseverance today. And I think central to the conversation is what you're describing here, Reid, that some of us view failure in a way that prompts us to stop trying. And then others of us view failure in a way that prompts us to lean in and keep trying. And so if you can view the near miss as good data, as an opportunity to evolve, then you are more likely to keep trying. And the more you continue to try, the more reps you get, the more iterations you try, the more likely you are to realize this goal or to eventually succeed. Whatever succeed means, it might mean accomplishing something that is then the end goal, or it might mean developing mastery like you're talking about.
Yeah, I like it. What's interesting, kind of as an aside, how many great like writers and painters were just dissatisfied with their works until even the time of their death, or there's something about the drive for constant improvement that leads to great people. I know there's a
Mm,
perfectionism side of that coin and self-criticism that we need to acknowledge and account for. But if you look at like Paul Cézanne only signed like 10% of his paintings before he died because he didn't think they were done. But these are the masterpieces out there. Or like Franz Kafka, he wanted all of his writings and sketches burned when he died. And his friend is like, when he dies, he's like, hell no, I'm not honoring that dying wish. And now we have his works that are considered great, even though some of the sentences aren't even complete.
hmm Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes me think of your example of Cezanne and the persistent folks of the world. You mentioned perfectionism. Like, there probably are different fuel sources, different reasons people persist in the face of failure. And some of them are likely more healthy than others, perhaps. Like, if you continue to persist because the the idea of ultimate failure is terrifying to you because it means something horrible about you, or it means that you'll be rejected or alone, or you're trying to prove something, like prove your worth in some kind of concrete way. um then yeah, that would be what I'd call kind of a dirty fuel source. um
Yeah. The masters out there realize there isn't an end. It's not like, say, from a career standpoint, it's not about getting something on your CV. Like, you're not done. It's about like finding your curiosities, interests, passions, doing them, learning as you go, and taking those failures as lessons and realizing that we're thriving not when we get it all done, but when we realize how much more we have to do and how much we love it.
mhm. Yeah. So, like, now I'm curious about, like, what are the factors that keep people from being more like that versus uh, the dirty fuel source example I was talking about? It makes me think of explanatory or attribution styles. You remember that
Mm,
social psychology stuff or positive psychology stuff?
yeah,
Like, we
yeah.
can make an attribution of something that happened, some phenomenon that happened either in our life or something that happened to us as global or specific, stable or unstable, external or internal, and whether or not you have a generally optimistic or generally pessimistic outlook on your perceived failures, um, can is responsible for which of those two sides you tend to fall on. So, if I got a
Yeah.
bad grade on a test, is it because I suck, or is it because I didn't study hard enough? Me sucking, not something I can. That's fairly global, specific, and internal. That's not something I have a lot of control over. But if I just didn't study
Yeah.
hard enough, that's fixable.
Yeah, and you know what's really interesting because for years I got interested in, is it Carol Dweck's work on
Dweck, yeah.
fixed versus growth mindset, but down those rabbit holes you find some really interesting things on the impact of praise and the impact of labels on, like you used an example of a test. So labels, aka stereotypes, um, that can play into these fixed or growth mindsets, like a person who believes that girls are bad at math or boys are bad at reading may form a fixed mindset. And the studies are fascinating because, like, just having students check a box about their gender and their race at the beginning of a test invoked internalized stereotypes that impacted performance, as one
Hmm.
example. It's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, our expectations, and the narratives, the stories that we have in our head really, really do affect our effort level.
Yeah.
If I'm pre-programmed with the idea that I shouldn't be able I'm not going to be good at this, then it might affect my effort level. That being said, some people will rebel against those, right? Whether it's a temperament
Yeah.
thing or something they've learned, like, oh, you don't think I can do it. And to motivate a person like that, sometimes you tell them things like that. You tell them, like, yeah, I don't know if you're really gonna, I don't know if you can do this. And it's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna prove that
Yeah.
I can.
Is that reverse psychology tips from a psychologist?
I think so. I think,
Yes.
but it doesn't work with everybody, right? Some people it'll just discourage the crap out of them.
You know, we were talking about parenting the other week, and it was actually Dweck herself and her research colleagues who did some really interesting work on praise, like praising a child's talents or gifts or labeling them as smart promotes a fixed mindset. And just to recap, like a fixed mindset is not the ideal, right? It's either
Mhm.
I'm either good at it or I'm not. It's just who I am. I can't change the world. I can't change myself. Uh, if you have to work hard, you don't have the ability. If I don't try, then I won't fail, those kind of things. Versus the growth mindset, I can learn and do anything I want, constantly evolving. I'm a work in progress. The more you challenge yourself, the smarter you become. I only fail when I'm dead or when I'm not trying. So she did studies that showed that if you give that kind of praise to a child as labeling them as smart or um, or just focusing on their gifts, it gives the message that they either have an ability or they don't. But if you praise their process, um, and put effort on, like, wow, like the effort, the strategy you used was impressive, good job, those are things that they can control over time, and you're at a formative age building a growth mindset.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes so much sense. So if we're no longer children and we find ourselves fettered by a fixed mindset, can we develop a growth mindset?
Yeah. Oh, it's a fun question, like that whole nature versus nurture debate that I love because it's not really a debate, it's always both. But we're
Mhm.
born with a certain amount of innate talents and abilities. We're all on the spectrum of everything somewhere. Like you're born with a certain amount of intelligence, and you can build on that no matter who you are, where you are. Um, you can kind of learn new things, right? You can build on that. So there are some ways that I think I've read about and tried on for undoing a fixed mindset. But do you have any pro tips first?
Yeah, I think um, it's a combination of addressing the mindset directly. So, in a therapeutic context, this might be, let's take a look at the beliefs that you have and see if any of these beliefs are no longer serve you. See if any of these beliefs are the product of early life conditioning that that you didn't deserve, right? It really had nothing to do with who you were. It might have been more to do with who was conditioning you. So we'll do some direct targeted work on the mindset. It's actually okay to fail. Here are the reasons why it's okay to fail. So that even if they don't feel it in their heart, they understand it in their head. And then we move to the level of the heart through some pretty simple exposure. Let's pick a skill you want to develop, and it's a low consequence skill. Like, I want to learn to play a song on the guitar. Cool. Let's take our growth mindset that we're practicing and apply it to this specific skill acquisition. What we want to do is we want to practice messing up as quickly as possible. So the quicker you can get to quote unquote failure, the quicker you can get to a mistake, the quicker you get data on how to get better at this thing that you want to get better at, playing this song on the guitar. So we frame practice as deliberate mistake cultivation. Like, let's go out there and
Hmm.
farm failures because that's the fruit that we're trying to get. That's our teacher. And if you take people or yourself just one step outside of your comfort zone, they start to get that positive feedback loop of mistake, adjustment, improvement, and then they start to build confidence. Confidence is built on this sort of bedrock or this substrate of competence. As their competence increases, these skills that they've acquired, their confidence will increase. And pretty soon, this idea cognitively that we started with, that failure is not a huge deal, in fact, it's an important part of the learning process, starts to sink into their heart. And then more dispositionally, they move from fixed mindset to growth mindset. But people need to know that, like, having a fixed or growth mindset isn't necessarily globally. It's not necessarily a global trait. You can have a fixed mindset about some things and a growth mindset about other things. People who are labeled as pessimists or people who struggle with depression, they tend to have more fixed mindsets about more things than growth. But yeah, it's flexible.
I like that. I like that. Um, some other things to add, perhaps. We've already talked about focusing on the journey and not the end result, like seeing the journey as the goal. The path
Hmm.
is you're on the path, and that's success already, as long as you're getting up and trying over and over again. Um, and bringing in this like yet disclaimer, like you're struggling with
Hmm.
something, reminding yourself you haven't mastered it yet. And in other ways, also paying attention to your words and thoughts, because we do have this, constant inner dialogue that is mostly negative, that we're not always aware of. But we can, by shining a bit of awareness on that, replace it with some like positive pep talk, like energy in the right direction instead of against your own hopes and dreams. And then, like you said, just showing up and getting out of your comfort zone, going to places and situations where you're not the best and where you're feeling uncomfortable, because that's like the soil for growth.
Right. But I'll reiterate that start really, really low threat. Start really, really small,
Yeah.
because for a variety of reasons, these people are super sensitive to failure, and so you don't want to jump all the way into the deep end. I think about, one of my kids is a pretty sensitive guy, um, dispositionally just sensitive, fairly anxious. And there are some things that he is incredibly persistent at, and then other things he wouldn't touch with a 50-foot pole. So those things, if they're at least partially something he wants to experience or develop, we'll start with a 49-foot pole and touch it with that,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
then just gradually work his way up uh, to intimate contact with the potential for failure in that area.
Yeah. It reminds me of that stress curve, the uh the good kind of stress, or the eustress versus the distress, or our window of
Hmm.
tolerance in therapy is, you've got to be inside the part of the comfort zone that is manageable for growth and not crippling, overwhelming, leading to fight, flight, freeze, shut down.
Hmm. Yeah, because too many experiences like that will reinforce the self-defeating mindset, right? That fixed mindset and those attributions that don't lend
Hmm.
themselves to confidence or competence.
Yeah, yeah. A couple other kind of relevant things from the literature, the social psychology literature around this, is like when you look at, so there are ways of removing like the ego from failure a little bit. Like one would be watching how people fail, looking at other people's failures before you take on a task. And I kind of
Mhm.
see this in my kids in this YouTube, TikTok generation. Like my twins, who are 14, are big into skiing. They're into bodybuilding. They're learning like things that I was into as well at that age, but they seem to be learning rapidly because they're watching and soaking all this stuff in. Like I went skiing with them a few weeks ago, and they're literally like doing backflips and 360s and things like that. Um, that, and that's a whole nother topic of how a parent feels about a backflip. It's like high five, and that was terrifying. But like it is research back to watch a YouTube video about common mistakes before you go hit the slopes yourself. And it kind of makes sense, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, a little priming. Prime
Yeah. And then
yourself to.
another,
I
oh,
was going to
go
say
ahead.
it's important to do that for a variety of reasons. It's just a great educational tool, but also um, it's also possible to watch the wrong YouTube videos that are just highlight reels of people's successes, and you get this false
Yep.
impression of the overnight success. You're comparing you in progress to somebody's finished product. Comparison is another
Yeah.
thing that has people very, very afraid of failure. They don't see that usually what the ticket price for exceptional performance is a hell of a lot of failures and a lot of struggling and a lot of choosing to pick oneself back up and persist in spite of failure.
Yeah, and the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell has that 10,000 hour rule around mastery and those outliers. And I think about that a lot when embarking on a new challenge task, developing a new skill, like just being gentle with yourself because you haven't put in your 1,000 or 10,000 hours yet, but you're on this path, and every moment practicing is just progressively moving again towards that ideal.
Right. Yeah, and I think Gladwell gets that number from a guy named Anders Ericsson, and he wrote a book called Peak. And it's about how those 10,000 hours, and the exact number is now debated in the research, but um, it's not just casual hours. It's something Erickson calls deliberate practice. It's a certain kind
Yeah.
of attentive practice where, apropos our topic, where you are very, very mindful of what the failures teach you. So you're making fine-tuned adjustments because you're really paying attention to mistakes and what you can do to improve.
Hmm.
If you're just sort of stumbling through those 10,000 hours, you're not going to develop the kind of expertise that these outliers developed in Gladwell's book.
Yeah. Yeah. What happens if you go to the gym every day and only do leg day?
I guess you get big ass legs.
But another thing that comes up for people that I've seen is the negative emotions interfering. like failure sucks, and like in terms of a feeling of failure. But as we know, feelings rise and fall, and in the spirit of like equanimity and slipping into the observer role, there's like research to show that if you look at yourself from that outside perspective and say, why did Steve fail instead of why did I fail?
Mhm.
um, it helps. Or like writing about the failure in a third person on paper. There are studies to back it, which I find fascinating.
So that's a good pro tip, what might you do to help yourself lean into a more growth mindset? Write about what happened in the third person.
And there's power in the sharing too. Like we many of us were raised to hide the vulnerability that is failure out of a sense of
Mhm.
shame, for example. Um, but again, if you look at like research done in this area, it's fascinating because you take like high schoolers and tell them to go teach middle schoolers about their mistakes. The
Mm.
high schoolers actually do better after teaching others, and then the middle schoolers give advice to elementary. The middle schoolers do better. Like you're a manager of a group in a company, you tell your employees how you failed, is not only vulnerable and connecting and relatable, but you get better. It's interesting.
Mhm. It is interesting. Important message for the people in our audience who are leaders of any kind, leaders, teachers, mentors, that you might feel tempted to hide your shortcomings, your mistakes, your failures. But if you can set the ego down and to the side, you're doing yourself and the people you're trying to lead or teach or guide a tremendous favor by sharing those things. It's also really humanizing. And as much as we love to worship people who seem godlike, I think it's even more gratifying to connect with people we relate to, especially people we think um, are doing really well, are succeeding at things we would like to succeed at. It's gratifying for me to discover the humanity of the people I look up to.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And then speaking of like work culture as an example, one of the big pitfalls of learning from failure seems to be blame. I think it applies to
Mm,
relationships big time. But like this idea of radical responsibility is one of the most empowering things, both in terms of what we're talking about here, like looking inside and how can I do better, but also um, in terms of the relationship itself.
yeah, I agree. I like the concept of extreme ownership without shame. right? There's taking too much responsibility for things, responsibility for other people's behavior or whatever. But especially when you're in a relationship like you describe, or you're in a leadership position, externalizing and blaming and excuse making and self victimization, it just doesn't usually turn out well for the organization or for the relationship. I can tell you when my wife and I navigate conflict the best is when we both come to the conflict taking responsibility. It puts
Yeah.
the other person at ease. You know, if we're coming to that conflict defensive and critical, ready to blame, ready to displace responsibility, then it's not going to go as well. We've done that enough that conflict feels pretty safe to navigate because we know that the other one is going to take at least some responsibility. Even if the responsibility in reality isn't 50-50, it'll feel like that when we approach it at least.
Yeah. Yeah. Things are never an equal divide, but if you're both aiming more than halfway, um, and then you're always good, right? You're always like, if you're always taking as much accountability, personal responsibility as you can. Um,
Mhm.
but on the flip side, like in work and in relationship, this culture of blame creates a culture where you're scared to bring things up and then you don't. Like mistakes are kind of um, brushed over, ignored, pretended they don't exist. You not only don't learn from them, but then things fester. And yeah, so I think this topic has a lot of interesting tangents.
Mhm. Yeah, I like your work culture tangent because, you know, we're talking about trying to adjust perspective about failure. But if the revealing your failures comes with punishment, comes with rejection, comes with criticism, then it's going to be hard to see failures as learning opportunities. Um,
Yeah.
so, like you're implying, if you're in a leadership position and you want people to come to you with their mistakes or their struggles, then don't punish them. You got to create a culture where that's encouraged. And
Yeah.
sure, we understand that sometimes somebody's going to have a pattern of not meeting their job description, and eventually they have to be let go, like in this sort of corporation context. But ultimately, you want to create a culture where people take responsibility and then make adjustments.
Yeah. And like you said about in your marriage, it creates that safe container to be able to navigate the conflict that will inevitably come up. It's part of life. And in work, it creates that safety to be able to like admit when we have these little failures that are crucial to growing. And in parenting, the same thing. Like one example is when my oldest daughter was able to drive. I had passed on, I guess, had a car for the kids that I had passed on, my last car. And she, within the first couple of months of driving, um, got into an accident where she was fine, but she clipped this trailer as she was rounding a bend, and the car had some significant damage. Um, and she was, because it was her first time experiencing something like this, she was a little scared to call and
Mm.
tell me about it. Even though I like to think I'm a pretty nice human in parenting situations and otherwise, understandably, she doesn't know how the reaction is going to be. But when she called and the reaction was like, it's okay. Are you okay? Is don't worry about the car. Then that kind of corrective experience or laying the foundation means they can open up about other things. And we see that in like kids behavior big time. Like you need to create a safe container for them to open up, or else they won't.
Hmm. Yeah. You also see it in therapy, right? I mean, one of the things that's so valuable about seeing a therapist is the lack of judgment. And once you're convinced of that as a client, that you can bring up all your messiness, you can air your dirty laundry, and the therapist isn't going to scold you or criticize you, you relax and you open up. And it's hard to work on stuff if the lid's on it. So, you know,
Yeah.
it's such an important aspect of being a professional helper. But you can extrapolate those qualities to your relationships, like you're describing parenting, but also romantic and occupational relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the intimate partnership front, some of my favorite tips are things like, well, seeking first to understand in any dialogue, like taking that stance, and being generous in your interpretation of the other's behavior and words, like giving the benefit of the doubt, not assuming the worst. Um, yeah, and then taking responsibility, like, for what you can do, and not saying you made me feel this way, or like, being careful with your own words, and just looking at your own locus of control.
Yeah, listening well makes a huge difference in a partnership, and at doing the things we're talking about, like reducing the threat of bringing up conflict, engaging in conversations that could lead to conflict.
Yeah. Um, and you mentioned therapy. It made me think of when I was in my training, still in residency. We'd all done this like personal therapy part of the process, like you and I have talked about on here, to get in that seat and see what it feels like. And then I was taking on my own clients solo for the first time. And one of my very early clients stuck with me because it was a very smart and articulate lady with BPD, borderline personality disorder, which, um, talk to your friendly neighborhood therapists, and they'll tell you that that's not the easiest condition to do therapy well with, right? There's a lot of
Hmm.
interpersonal stuff to keep in mind. And I tell you, though, the hours and the weeks and the months of me struggling as a new young therapist helped me, one, realize how little I know. Um, and, but in a manageable way, realizing that I was on a path of learning that is crucial to getting good at something. Like, and it was that uncomfortable zone of like, okay, keep showing up, keep learning, growing, integrating, and then pretty soon the unmanageable feels manageable, and you develop those skills and confidence, like you were saying.
Yeah. So you had some personal experience with this then, like of stepping into that just zone of discomfort, um, and noticing that I guess you reaped the benefits. You developed skill, but you had to be willing to be uncomfortable. I remember kind of a similar story watching videotape of some of my early therapy attempts at therapy in graduate school. And I remember we finished watching a tape, and my supervisor said, "Okay, Steve, how was that?" And I said, "Excruciating." And he said, "Interesting, excruciating. Why is that?" "Well, I just feel like I wasn't doing a good job, et cetera, et cetera." And he's like, "Okay, next time you show me tape, that you pick the clip, I want you to show me the most excruciating parts." It has to be. You don't show me
Mm,
your wins, only show me the excruciating parts. And it was
yeah.
great. It was great at desensitizing me to just like exposing myself there and getting the best feedback and learn. And that's when I started to experience the most growth as a therapist, for sure. Instead of just giving them a highlight reel of
Oh
like,
yeah.
"Hey, praise me, look at how good a job I did."
What do you know? Sitting with the discomfort again.
Hmm. Seems to be a
Yeah.
theme. Well, any other sort of useful tidbits about how one might develop grit or resilience in the face of failure? I'm sure there are people listening wondering, like, in addition to what we've already said, stepping into that zone of discomfort. Um, I'll let you think for a second. I've got one. One is
Yeah.
this intervention we use for people with chronic anxiety or generalized anxiety disorder, who tend to worry, and that's playing the tape forward. Sometimes people are really afraid of what failure is, what it might imply, but they actually don't think too much further beyond the feeling of not wanting to fail. So we might ask somebody, "Okay, you're afraid of messing up here. Like you're afraid, I'll go back to the test example. You're afraid of failing this test. Okay. Let's imagine the worst case scenario. Let's play that tape forward. Well, what would happen if you failed the test? Well, then I failed the class. Okay, well then what? What would happen after you failed the class? I'd have to retake the class. Okay, and then if you had to retake the class, well, that'd be really inconvenient. I might not graduate on time. Okay, well then and so you just keep going until they get to the worst case scenario, which usually isn't desirable. It's called the worst case scenario for a reason, but it's also usually not insurmountable. It's usually not the end of the world. And so if you can get them accustomed or used to, or at least acquainted with the worst case scenario, the fear of, 50 degrees removed from the worst case scenario that they're actually encountering isn't as scary. So they're a little bit more willing to engage in the thing that could result in failure.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I don't have any additional tips to add to the mix, but just maybe a word of caution around overconfidence, or what some might call the God complex.
Mm.
Um, and I think doctors and professionals are more guilty of this than others, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's just really fascinating. I remember this one study looked at 15,000 judgments that people have, where 98% of the time they thought they were right, but were right only 30% of the time. And there's this, what's it called? I've seen it a couple times lately, the Dunning-Kruger effect or whatever. The more we
Mm-hmm.
learn and know, the more we realize how much we don't know, how little we
Mm-hmm.
know. And that I think is the beautiful stance that propels the ongoing quest of improving, like the admitting that we don't know it all and that there's always more to learn and practice.
Yeah, there's no final boss in the video game of life. You don't finish. There's no 100% completion. It is like you referenced at the beginning of the show about the journey. So
Yeah.
there's no way to fail a journey. That you just sort of explore and keep journeying. So that's our invitation to you, dear listeners. Keep on keeping on. Treat failures as teachers, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinous at numinous.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinous YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.